Hello and welcome to a Tuesday Tea-ology. Hope your Tuesday is going okay, and that you're able to take a minute here and join us for some tea-ology. Our theological uh, study has led us to the doctrine of the fall, the doctrine of sin. And the big theological word for the doctrine of sin is hamartiology. Hamartiology. You don't need to remember that, although you can pull it out at lunchtime and impress your friends. Tell them you've been thinking about hamartiology. But the doctrine of sin matters. It's very important. It's not fun to talk about, fun to think about wickedness, darkness, sin and guilt and death. But it's important for us to understand because it is a major feature of the world, the situation we find ourselves in. And we're aware of that on the local scale and on the global scale. On the global scale, if you probably have had in your prayers lately the nation of Ukraine, and they might not have been much on your thoughts before the past couple weeks, but what's going on over there, the Russian invasion and all of the suffering caused by this aggression and wickedness, this is sin playing out. And sin is just destructive. Sin is deadly. It destroys human life and the rest of creation. But it's not just on big global kind of events. It comes out personally too, in ways you've been hurt, and yes, when you take an honest look at yourself, ways that you say, I've hurt other people. This is sin playing out in the world, and so our picture of the world has to include this reality of sin, guilt, death, the reality of the fall, because that is the problem that the gospel addresses. The wonderful good news, the gospel, is that God has made a solution for sin and death. But you can't really fully understand a solution until you understand the problem it's addressing. So, we started talking about the doctrine of sin. Even though the fall of mankind has had a much, sweeping consequences through creation, it nonetheless is preceded and plays into something even beyond that. There seems to have been an angelic rebellion, a satanic rebellion before that. So the fall of mankind is a part of a bigger cosmic picture. And we talked last week about the event of the fall, that forbidden fruit, and taking of the forbidden fruit, listening to the temptation of the devil instead of believing God and trusting God. And that is the heart of sin, the failure to believe God, to trust God, to be loyal to God. And the first sin is so remarkable because it really focuses in on what sin is all about. If the first sin had been some violent act from one person to another, then we might have thought that that was essential to sin. But the first sin was really just a matter of pure disobedience to God, and that helps us to center on what lies at the heart of sin. And so we need to begin processing, getting a clearer picture of what the fall, sin, death, what these things are all about. And so as we look at the consequences that unfolded from the fall, what sin means, we get a grasp, a bigger grasp of this concept and the nature of the problem with the world, the ultimate problem that underlies all of the problems with the world, the problem of sin. The first thing we see as an unfolding consequence from the fall is sin and shame. That's not the whole of the consequences. We might summarize, kind of the ultimate consequence as death, and death plays in, very shortly. But the first thing we see is guilt and shame. I might have said sin and shame a moment ago. Sin is the thing, guilt and shame is the first result that we see. Because when we read in Genesis chapter 3, And after we read about the act of sin, verse 6, here it is. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And then in verse 7, this is what we read, the first consequences of this. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. Well, this can seem a little bit awkward. What is the meaning of this passage? Well, we're watching, what happens, and this is the moment when they know and to some extent maybe begin to realize that they have been deceived because because what the serpent said was, when you eat of it, this is verse 5, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. That was the promise. Your eyes would be opened, and it would bring this new godlikeness. They eat of the fruit, and then the eyes of both were open. Okay, so in some way, the serpent's words were true. Their eyes were opened. But we don't hear then it expressed in this sense of greater godlikeness, of heightened wisdom. Their eyes are opened, and yet this doesn't seem to have brought them some ascension to a higher level. Instead, this seems to have brought them down. This seems to have created a problem, which it has. They have sinned. They maybe don't realize it yet, but they've been separated from God by sin, and the consequences begin to unfold. And the first thing is the guilt and shame that comes. They knew they were naked. Instead of having an immediate sense of God-likeness, they have an immediate sense of shame, and they try to cover. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And so they tried to cover this nakedness that they had now discovered. And of course, the nakedness is literal there. When we read the creation narrative, we hear, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And so their nakedness did not change. That was there. But what happened was, from being not ashamed, they now became ashamed. Why did they become ashamed? Because they now had lost their innocence. And there is a parallel here in just human development, that when you have a child, they have this innocence about them. They're not innocent of sin, but they have a lack of understanding of some things. And so when you have a little child, you need to convince them to engage in modesty, to cover themselves, because they don't feel in themselves and understand the need. Adam and Eve were not little children in terms of understanding, but they were innocent. And when their eyes were open to see good and evil, suddenly they had lost their innocence. What had been appropriate and acceptable before now had to be covered. And so it is a physical reality, but it goes beyond that. It is a demonstration of the loss of innocence, the arrival of guilt and shame. That having an understanding of good and evil does not necessarily bring guilt and shame. God indeed knows good and evil. But if you are evil, then having an understanding of evil brings guilt and shame. And the thing is that when they committed this first act of sin, they at the same time became aware of sin, good and evil. They lost their innocence and became corrupt. And so they realize now the need to cover. And that is the tragedy. That is how the promise did not go in that way. They had become more like God in one sense, but in a deeper sense, they had become less like God because they aren't God. They're made in the image of God, but we are not God. And so this need to cover guilt and shame then becomes a reality of the human experience. And there is something of a distinction we may make. Guilt is a status thing, although it can bring a sense of guilt. If I do something wrong, I am guilty. If I go into the court and I am convicted of doing something wrong, they will declare me guilty. In God's perfect justice, his declarations are always true. If he says guilty, it's because someone is guilty. And so our guilt is both a sense that we have of our wrongness, of our fallenness and sinfulness, and it also is the verdict that stands against us unless we receive the forgiveness, the justification, the declaration of righteousness that comes in Jesus Christ. Shame, shame is particularly centered on that sense of ourselves, although other people can engage in ways that are shaming. And shame is about feeling bad about something. And the tricky thing, of course, is that shame is not necessarily right. Um, we can shame people for things they shouldn't be ashamed of. We can feel ashamed of things that we shouldn't be ashamed of. And on the other hand, we can very easily not feel ashamed of things we ought to feel ashamed of. We can twist our sense of shame so that we're ashamed of the wrong things. And we recognize that with someone who is a particularly, bold in some area of sin, we refer to them as shameless. And we say that is just shameless. And that's an extra wrongness onto something that we recognize, so and so did this thing and they don't even feel a sense of shame. It's one thing to steal. It's even worse to steal and not feel bad about it. So we recognize that the moral sense inside has an impact on the wrongness, in a sense, of the thing that is done. And so this sense of guilt and shame is the first sort of result that is visible. Now, sin is the reality, and death on one level is an immediate result, even if they don't realize it. But what is realized is this sense of guilt and shame, and that uh, defines the human condition apart from God. We are guilty, and we are looking for some way to be free of the guilt, of the condemnation, of the shame. And people pursue all kinds of ways. There are, of course, other religions that claim to offer freedom from your guilt. And there is, of course, a denial of it that comes in all kinds of ways, whether through an atheistic, psychological kind of framework or whatever, but just an acceptance of yourself where you feel no guilt and shame and reject it. There's a deadening of your guilt and shame in whatever means you take to do that. So there's all kinds of approaches people take to try to deal with this because it is a defining feature of human existence. But the good news is that God has offered uh, the only real and successful way to deal with the human problem of sin, and thus with the guilt and shame that results from sin. God's solution is to deal with the heart of the problem. Guilt and shame are symptoms. They're symptoms of this reality of sin, and God has sent His Son to deal with the problem of sin. And Jesus Christ, when He went to the cross, He bore the sins of the world. He bore the sins of all of those who will come to him and receive by faith his sacrifice on your behalf. And when you place your faith in Christ, when you are united with him by the Spirit and receive his righteousness credited to you in place of your sin, then the guilt is taken away because it because the sin which the guilt concerns isn't there. Now, you may still struggle to appropriate that, to experience that, to believe, to accept that reality. But the reality of guilt is dealt with by Christ dealing with the reality of sin. And the gospel of Jesus Christ is the solution to the human problem. Well, I hope that you have embraced that gift of forgiveness and healing that is found in Jesus Christ. And I hope that the rest of your week goes good. The Lord bless you and be with you and care for you in every way. Bye-bye.